Welcome back to the final session of the Inheritance Conference. In this session, speakers will share about actions or projects that date back about 5 years, that either removed or recontextualized problematic artwork or that preserved sites and stories that were endangered. This is the last panel of the conference, and it's going to be enriching for everyone to hear about these projects and panelists' reflections on the impacts they've had over the last 5 years or so. So just want to give a few quick notes about Zoom if you're joining us for the first time today. If you've got any questions or comments for the panelists, feel free to use the Q&A box, and you can see the icon for that at the bottom of your screen. The session moderator has access to that box, and so she will draw from it when she moderates the panel conversation at the end of the session. The chat box is open to everyone, so feel free to use that, and you can introduce yourself, tell others where you're zooming in from if you'd like to. The first speaker of the day, Sháńdíín Brown, a citizen of the Navajo Nation and jeweler, is the RISD Museum Henry Luce Curatorial Fellow for Native American Art. Previously, she's held positions at the Heard Museum, Hood Museum of Art, IAIA Museum of Contemporary Native Arts, and School for Advanced Research Indian Arts Research Center. Our second speaker, Raphael Morris, is the board president of Greenwood Cemetery Preservation Association in St. Louis. Raphael started his career at Monsanto and worked for over 36 years in the agrochemical, agricultural, and pharmaceutical industries, retiring in 2015 from ICL. As an alderman for Pagedale, Missouri, he served his community for 4 terms. Dr. Anton Treuer, Leech Lake, Ojibwe, is professor of Ojibwe at Bemidji State University. He is editor of the Oshkabewis Native Journal, the only academic journal of the Ojibwe language, and his books include, and this is truly just a sampling because he is incredibly prolific, and actually I will when I'm done. Everyone's bios right now are very short. We have much more information about the speakers on the website, and I'm going to put that link into the chat box for everyone when the presentations start. But a sampling of his books include Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask, The Language Warriors Manifesto, How to Keep Our Languages Alive No Matter the Odds, The Cultural Toolbox, Traditional Ojibwe Living in the Modern World, Warrior Nation, History of the Red Lake Ojibwe, and Ojibwe in Minnesota. So our first speaker is Sháńdíín Brown. Welcome, Sháńdíín.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sháńdíín Brown, and like Marissa said, I'm the RISD Museum Henry Luce Curatorial Fellow for Native American Art. Today, I'm going to be giving a presentation titled A Closer Look at the Hovey Murals at Dartmouth College. And I want to give a big thank you to everyone who's here today. I'm really honored to be here with Anton and Raphael, and I appreciate your presence today. I also want to give a quick note and preface this presentation by saying that I will be mentioning sexual violence at the end of the presentation, and I encourage you all to prepare yourself emotionally and, if need be, excuse yourself. So I want to begin today by offering a land acknowledgement. The Rhode Island School of Design is built on what is now called College Hill, part of the ancestral homelands of the Narragansett Nation. Indigenous people from many nations, near and far, live, study, and work in Providence today. The amplification of Native voices and histories is crucial to rectifying the many violent legacies of colonialism, and we gratefully acknowledge the ongoing critical contributions of Indigenous people across our state, region, and nation. I encourage you to visit nativeland.ca to recognize which tribal nation or nations' homelands you currently reside on, and express gratitude as well as appreciation to those people and lands. I'm going to introduce myself now in Diné or Navajo language. Yat shike do shidine she Haley Sháńdíín Brown hinishya, kia ani nishle, bilagana bashichin, flisatlana dushache, do bilagana dushanele, ak ego Diné et on nishle. So, hi everyone, my name is Sháńdíín, and like was mentioned before, I'm a citizen of the Navajo Nation. I'm giving you this presentation today, not only coming from the perspective of a Native American art professional, but also a graduate of Dartmouth College, where I earned my Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology and Native American Studies with a minor in Environmental Studies. So for context for today's presentation, I wanted to talk about the brief history, but important history of Dartmouth College. Dartmouth College was founded by Eliezer Wheelock, a congregational minister from Connecticut. Wheelock persuaded his former pupil, Samson Occam, a member of the Mohegan tribe and Presbyterian cleric, to travel to England to raise money for what Occam believed would be a school dedicated to educating and Christianizing Native American students. Occam secured more than £10,000 in donations for the school that would become Dartmouth College. On Occam's return to the United States, he learned that Wheelock had failed to care for his wife and children while he was away. Furthermore, Wheelock decided to move Dartmouth College to New Hampshire, and he used the funds for Dartmouth to educate sons of American colonists rather than Native Americans, which was the original plan. So now I'm going to share just briefly an excerpt that's important and critical to understanding this history. The Dartmouth College Charter, which was granted by King George III of Great Britain in 1769, so note this is before the American Revolution, the charter states, "The college erected in our said province of New Hampshire by the name of Dartmouth College for the education and instruction of youth of Indian tribes in this land in reading, writing, and all parts of learning which shall appear necessary and expedient for civilizing and Christianizing children of pagans, as well as in liberal arts and sciences, and also of English youth and any others." So note here in the charter, we do see, and I have it bolded, for the education and instruction of youth of the Indian tribes in this land, for civilizing and Christianizing children of pagans. We see in a 1771 archival record that Occam writes, "You're having so many white scholars and so few or no Indian scholars gives me great discouragement." And between 1769 and 1970, Dartmouth College graduated only 20 Native American students. So we're going to fast forward about 160 years. Of course, a lot of history happens at Dartmouth College, but for today's presentation, we're fast forwarding to 1932. In 1932, Jose Clemente Orozco painted the Epic of American Civilization between 1932 and 1934 in Dartmouth College's Baker Library. The 24 fresco panels comprising the mural cover about 3,200 square feet of wall space, and in 2013 it was designated as a National Historic Landmark. As Dartmouth professor Mary Coffey writes, Jose Clemente Orozco reorients the Epic of America from the standard U.S. narrative that begins with British colonization along the northeastern seaboard and proceeds heroically west to a Mexican story rooted in Mesoamerican civilizations and the devastation wrought by the Spanish conquest. Orozco presents America's epic as cyclical in nature, the eternal return of destruction and creation, rather than a linear tale of democratic expansion and progress. So Orozco painted the mural during the same time his fellow Mexican muralist Diego Rivera was working on murals at the Rockefeller Center in New York. And if you're not aware of this story and the history there, Rivera decided to paint a portrait of Lenin, which led to his mural project being destroyed. And at Dartmouth, Orozco was given full political freedom to paint as he chose. His images, in fact, offended a group of Dartmouth parents who called themselves the Boston Mothers. In a letter they wrote, "We would be everlasting grateful to you if the pictures could be destroyed." And this was in a letter to the then Dartmouth College president, Ernest Hopkins. President Hopkins corresponded back, "There are 100% Americans who have objected to the fact that we employed a Mexican to do this work," he wrote. "But I've never believed that art could be made either racial or national." And he defended Orozco's right to paint these images. So there's a lot of history here, and I really encourage you to further research the Epic of American Civilization. But for today's presentation, that was all the information that I felt like I could share. So we see that the Hovey murals, which is what the presentation is about today, were a direct response to Orozco's Epic of American Civilization. The Hovey murals were painted by Walter Beach Humphrey, who was a American artist and illustrator, and he was a Dartmouth class of 1914. Humphrey actually persuaded President Hopkins to allow him to create another mural that would, quote, be more Dartmouth in character. These murals were painted on the walls of the faculty dining hall or grill at the college, based on a drinking song by Richard Hovey, who was a Dartmouth class of 1885. It depicts the mythical founding of the college by Eliezer Wheelock. So there's Humphrey's painting. And now we're going to look at the mural slides, and I'm going to repeat the drinking song. So for context, when I was a freshman at Dartmouth College, I saw these the morning after the 2016 presidential election, which conjured a lot of feelings and emotion for me. But for now, we'll look at the images and look at the lyrics. So the drinking song goes, "Oh, Eliezer Wheelock was a very pious man. He went into the wilderness to teach the Indian. With a gratis ad parnasum, a Bible and a drum, and 500 gallons of New England rum. Fill the bowl up, drink to Eliezer and his primitive Alcazar, where he mixed drinks for the heathen in the goodness of his soul. The big chief that met him was the sachem of the Wahoo-Was. If he was not a big chief, there was never one you saw who was. He had tobacco by the cord, 10 squaws, and more to come, but he never yet had tasted of New England rum. Fill the bowl up, fill the bowl up." Eliezer and the big chief harangued and gesticulated. They founded Dartmouth College, and the big chief matriculated. Eliezer was the faculty, and the whole curriculum was 500 gallons of New England rum. Fill the bowl up, fill the bowl up. Note that in these murals, there's no mention of Samson Occam, the Mohegan individual who helped raise funds for Dartmouth College, nor is there mention of Abenaki people who call New Hampshire and Dartmouth's campus home. So again, we're fast forwarding a lot of time for today's presentation. So fast forward to 1970. John Kemeny, who was Dartmouth's 13th president, pledged to redress the historical lack of opportunities for Native Americans in higher education. This recommitment established the Native American program, laid the groundwork for the Native American Studies Department, and directed the admissions office to actively recruit Native American students. Furthermore, in 1971, the Dartmouth Board of Trustees voted to officially institute coeducation and allow women to attend Dartmouth. So, when the new student population came onto campus and saw the murals in the dining hall, they were disturbed to say the least. Once an exclusive dining space where Dartmouth men would eat steak and smoke cigars, the room that housed the murals was cleared out and locked away from the public in 1979 due to Native American students and female students' disturbed emotional responses. For many years, people had forgotten about the space and murals except for brief periods of controversy. When the murals were discussed, it was either with Dartmouth alumni having extreme nostalgia or extreme distaste. In 1983, the paintings were covered by specially made panels that were bolted into the supporting woodwork. The mural continued to be unveiled for commencement and reunions, but this stopped in the early 1990s. The Native American Council at Dartmouth then recommended that the murals be uncovered and the room be reopened with a didactic program written by a committee of Native students. So the murals were then uncovered, but Native students at the time opposed the writing as they felt uncomfortable addressing the mural at all and felt like a task of writing about the mural was too much of a burden to handle, especially with the sexualization of Native women and the fraught history of alcohol in Native American communities. That idea was abandoned, and the mural was available for teaching and discussed in an academic conference from the early 1990s until 2018, when President Phillips J. Hanlon announced they would be removed and stored in an off-site storage facility associated with Dartmouth Hood Museum. So the path to removal, how did this happen? In 2018, the Native Americans at Dartmouth, which is the Dartmouth Native Student Group, sent a letter to college president Phil Hanlon asking him to do something about the murals. So his administration formed a study group to consider whether to lock the dining hall or what was the best solution. The study group was led by Bruce Dutu, professor of Native American Studies at the college, and Juliet Bianco, deputy director at the time of the Hood Museum. They consulted with college alumni, art historians, structural engineers, and Native American students. In addition, people who were also on the committee and the study group were Kiana Miss Burke, a Dartmouth class of 12, and former interim director of the Native American program, Mary Kofi, associate professor of art history, Brooke Hadley, a member of Native Americans at Dartmouth in class of 2018, Jenny Harlan, Native Americans at Dartmouth student in class of 20, and Nick Rio, assistant professor of Native American and environmental studies. So this group led to the Hovey murals removal, and President Hanlon said the derogatory images in the Hovey murals convey disturbing messages that are incompatible with Dartmouth's mission and values. Moving them off campus to hood storage is the right thing to do. In response, the study group and Native American students stated, "We are pleased with President Hanlon's decision. In addition to their disparaging treatment of Native Americans, the murals objectify women and belittle their intellectual capacity. We believe the murals should be moved, but as an artifact of Dartmouth's history and a work of art, however contentious and disrespectful, they should be conserved." And here is Polimana Joshevma, who was a student at the time and the president of Native Americans at Dartmouth. And, you know, as I was a student at the time, a lot of people wanted them to be destroyed, but they came to this conclusion working within the institution that the history should be preserved so that things like this don't happen again, or at least that's what we can hope for. So I really want to conclude this presentation by stating that as a Native American woman, a Native American art professional, and a Native American women's rights advocate, I see a clear and distinct link between this country's sexualization of Native American women and the rampant sexual violence against Native American women that occurs in what is now called the United States of America. Furthermore, the Hovey murals are a prime example of objectification and sexualization of Native women and give us insight into how Native women have historically been perceived and are still perceived on Dartmouth's campus. So for some violence against Native women statistics, and this is all from the NCAI or National Congress of American Indian Policy Insights brief about statistics on violence against Native women. The report states American Indians and Alaska Natives are 2.5 times as likely to experience violent crimes and at least 2 times more likely to experience rape or sexual assault crimes compared to all other races. 61% of American Indian and Alaska Native women, or 3 out of 5, have been assaulted in their lifetimes. Among Native women victims of assault, an average of 63% describe the offender as non-Native. 34% of American Indian and Alaska Native women will be raped in their lifetimes. Among Native women victims of rape or sexual assault, an average of 67% describe the offender as non-Native. And in 2015 student survey found that half of Native women at Dartmouth had experienced sexual violence in their time there. So, you know, as a student and as a Native American art professional, it felt good for those to be removed because there's such a rampant aspect of sexual violence against Native women on that campus and in our country in general. And for anyone who's watching today who's a survivor and who's Native, I encourage you to reach out to Strong Hearts Native Helpline. If you're ever dealing with things, there's always help out there. And if you're not Native, please reach out to the National Sexual Assault Hotline or go to rain.org. So today you can still see images of the Hovey murals on the Hood Museum's website. If you'd like to research them further, I encourage you to do so. But like I said, they are in an off-site location and they're no longer on Dartmouth's campus. To conclude here, I want to note that you can read more about this process. It was a very involved process and I only had, a certain amount of time today to share. But this book which is called the Hovey Murals at Dartmouth College, Culture and Context, is a really great resource, and it's from Native American professors at Dartmouth, art professors at Dartmouth, and Native women at Dartmouth and their feelings on the Hovey Murals. It was published in 2011, so that path to removal aspect is not included. But like I said, it's a really great resource, especially if you want to learn more. And I just, again, want to say thank you to everyone for coming and attending. And like I said, I definitely encourage everyone to do their own individual research, because the story is, of course, very nuanced. And there's a lot of aspects to discuss that we didn't get to today. So thank you.
Good afternoon. I want to start by saying I really appreciate this opportunity to participate this afternoon. I've never been a part of a forum like this before, so it's been quite an experience for me, and I have really thoroughly enjoyed a lot of the presentations so far. I think the first question I asked Marissa when she contacted me was, "Are you sure you got the right person?" And after she assured me that she did, I said, "Okay, well, here I am." I want to first start off by a little bit of the background about Greenwood Cemetery. First slide, please. Greenwood Cemetery was established on 6 acres during the post-Civil War era in 1874 by Herman Kruger, a former caretaker for St. Peter's Cemetery, which is right up the street from Greenwood. It was the first non-sectarian commercial cemetery for African Americans in the St. Louis metro area. Mr. Kruger continued to purchase more land, and the cemetery grew to 31.85 acres. The family operated and maintained the cemetery for over a century, then sold it to a local businessman. There are over 50,000 people interred at Greenwood, with the last burial taking place in 1993. The last owner walked away once the cemetery became full, and the Friends of Greenwood took over the cemetery and had Greenwood placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 2004. Eventually, they aged out, died out, and they too had to walk away from this massive project. So in 2016, the Greenwood Preservation Association was established as a nonprofit organization committed to preserving the rich history and restoring the grounds to its former beauty. Greenwood was listed as a St. Louis County Historic Landmark in 2016. Next slide, please. I'd like to briefly talk about some of our most famous and infamous people who are interred in the cemetery. First being Harriet Robinson Scott, who was the wife of Dred Scott, the freedom suit plaintiff, and their daughters Lizzie and Eliza are buried in Greenwood. Dred and Harriet, after 11 years of court battles, eventually lost their freedom suit case before the Supreme Court in 1857. Justice Taney ruled in a 6-3 decision that Black people were inferior to whites, weren't and couldn't be U.S. citizens, and had no rights to file federal lawsuits. Next slide, please. Sheldon Hunt Tandy served in Company B of the 13th Regiment of the Missouri State Militia during the Civil War. He continued his service as a U.S. land agent, deputy U.S. Marshal, civil rights activist, and lawyer. Tandy was the author of the first bill in Missouri providing for the education of Negroes. Tandy is perhaps best remembered as the champion of the Exodusters. He was the first St. Louisan to aid the colored exodus from the South in 1879. He assisted over 2,000 African-American migrants who were leaving the post-Reconstruction South for homes in Kansas, who had become stranded in St. Louis. Grant Green. Grant Green was an American jazz guitarist and composer. Throughout his career, he favored soul jazz, jazz blues, jazz funk, hard bop, bebop, and Latin tinged music. Considered a severely underrated player during his lifetime, Grant Green is one of the great unsung heroes of jazz guitar. Stagger Lee Shelton. Stagger Lee on Christmas Eve, 1895, a shooting occurred in a North St. Louis saloon that was destined to find a prominent and permanent place in American oral tradition. The participants were two Black men, a levy hand named William Billy Lyons, and a part-time carriage driver and full-time pimp named Lee Shelton. In the course of an argument, Billy snatched Lee's Stetson hat from his head, whereupon Lee struck him and then shot him. Billy died of his wound shortly thereafter. Shelton was charged, tried, and convicted of the murder in 1897. He was pardoned in 1909, but returned to prison in 1911 for assault and robbery and died while incarcerated in 1912. These are the bare bones of the case upon which have been piled countless folktales, legends, and outright lies, ultimately giving rise to what has become one of the most popular American murder ballads, as well as one of the most widely adapted songs in our national history. Stagger Lee has been reinvented innumerable times as a work chant, field holler, blues, rag, jazz, rock, and folk song. It surfaced as the theme of a major work, Stagger Lee Wonders, by noted poet James Baldwin, and is the subject of the book Stagger Lee Shot Billy by Cecil Brown. Next slide, please. Lucy Ann Delaney. Lucy Ann Delaney is a formerly enslaved person who later became an activist, Masonic founder, and author. She is known for her 1891 narrative, From the Darkness Cometh the Light, Our Struggles for Freedom. Her book is the only first-person account of a freedom suit and one of the few post-emancipation published slave narratives. Her case was one of 301 freedom suits filed in St. Louis from 1814 to 1860. Arsenia Williams. Arsenia was known as, in the St. Louis African-American community, as the human dynamo, an educator in St. Louis public schools for nearly 50 years. She served as president of the St. Louis and Missouri chapters of the National Association of Colored Women. She was the first chairperson of the Phillips Weekly YWCA and served as the dean of the Women's Home Missionary Society of Missions. She was the only woman on the committee to organize Negro Day for the 1904 World's Fair. In the early 1900s, she, along with Mary L. Harrison and Mary Ford Pitts, helped the suffragist movement within the African-American community. They believed through the vote, the quality of life for so many could change for the better. Next slide, please. I'm often asked how I got involved with the restoration of Greenwood Cemetery. And I always respond by saying, it'll be 7 years in July since I've been involved with the cemetery. I was off from my job one day due to carpal tunnel surgery. And my wife and I were watching the news, and as she was getting ready for work, there's a story that came on where a gentleman was complaining about the conditions of the cemetery. He operated a business across the street, and he was saying that the cemetery was making his business and the community look bad. So I was telling my wife, I said, you know, I remember as a child riding down St. Louis Avenue where the cemetery is located, and my dad stopping in front of it. I believe I was about 10 or 11 years of age. And he told me, you have family in the cemetery. And of course, that went straight over my head. But when I saw that news story, I wondered if that was the same cemetery that he had pointed out to me so many years ago. So they were trying to form a group to see what could be done about correcting this wrong that had taken place in the cemetery. So I decided I was going to go by there to see, you know, if it was something I wanted to get involved with or what I could do to help change the direction of the cemetery. I was the first one to arrive that Saturday morning, parked in front of the cemetery on the street, and you could not see a single stone on the property. The growth was easily 15 to 20 feet tall from the front to the back. It was so thick you couldn't take 2 steps walking through. Shortly thereafter, other people began to arrive, and I believe we had about 15 or 20. And we talked about how we could change the conditions of the cemetery. We agreed that we'd get together every Saturday and start, you know, chomping away at this project and see what we could do. But the way things go, you know, that went from every Saturday to every other Saturday to when we could get together. And so I told my wife, I said, you know, this is not a Saturday project. So I think I'm going to go ahead and retire and devote my time to trying to reclaim the cemetery. I was looking for a reason to retire anyway, so I said, why not? So anyway, that's what I did. And I started working on this and started making some pretty good progress, but it's such a tremendous undertaking that, you know, it was requiring a lot of effort from a lot of people. And the picture here is one of our board members. It's Luce Shannon. He generally handles a lot of the military burials and organizing events surrounded around the military. But this is kind of a snapshot of what the majority of the cemetery looked like in 2015. Next slide, please. This is another section. This picture, I believe, was probably from 2016. This is a section D. And once again, another snapshot of what the cemetery had become over years of neglect. Next slide, please. Once again, another portion of the cemetery. I know I'm being redundant here, but this is truly what the cemetery looked like in 2015-16 when we started with this project. Next slide. And once again, another section. This is probably late 2016. This looks like it's probably section E. And the growth isn't quite as bad here because we obviously have been working on this section. We have so many issues in the cemetery besides just the overgrowth. We have so many infrastructure issues. Our roads are in bad shape. Countless number of tombstones that have fallen over due to severe erosion throughout the cemetery. You name it, we're dealing with all sorts of issues there. And the biggest problem is the cemetery was never endowed. So most everything we do is out of pocket. You know, we're constantly in a fundraising mode, trying to raise money to continue the work that we're doing. And we do what we can do, but a lot of times it's so frustrating because we don't get any type of support, you know, be it local, state, federal, from anybody. We're constantly got a GoFundMe page going, or Facebook birthday celebrations or what have you, anything we can do to try to generate income. But more times than not, you know, the board, we've got a tremendous board. We put our monies together a lot of times and make a lot of things happen on our own. Next slide, please. Once again, I know I'm getting very redundant here, but just trying to give you a flavor for what Greenwood Cemetery looked like in 2015 after the Greenwood Cemetery Preservation Association became involved. Next slide. Once again, this is section C. This is a section where Harry Scott is buried. As you can see, the growth above this lady's head is probably 12 to 15 tall, 15 feet tall right there. And it probably goes back several acres. Next slide, please. Now, if you talk about areas being underserved, if you look it up in the dictionary, if you look up the definition for underserved, you'll probably find Hillsdale, Missouri. This is where Greenwood is located. We are, unfortunately, there are 6 or 7 streets that dead into the cemetery. And Hillsdale being such an underserved community, they don't have bulk trash pickup. So what happens a lot of times, it gets dumped into the cemetery. You know, our plate is full constantly with just trying to clear these sections and make them nice for the visitors to come back and find their loved ones. But when we have to deal with situations like this, it makes our job all the more, that much more difficult. And it's an ongoing problem that for some reason, it appears that what we're doing there in the cemetery probably hasn't really resonated with the community, and we're constantly dealing with situations like this. Next slide, please. Now, 3 weeks ago, we had a cleanup of that section in the last slide. And what you're looking at is a 40-yard dumpster that we completely filled with trash and debris just from that section. But what you can't see is there's another dumpster in front of this one that's about half full. Now, this is just from one section of the cemetery. There's another section where we also have the same issues with dumping. So our hands are constantly full with not only trying to maintain the grounds and clear the grounds, but also dealing with all this type of activity. Next slide, please. Look at this. These pictures were taken a little over a week ago. This is the very front sections of the cemetery. This is where I parked along the street 7 years ago. And like I said, the growth was probably 15 to 20 feet tall. But this is the way the front part of the cemetery looks now. This is our east and west lawn. And to the right, this is section A and B. So we're very proud to say that we've been able to keep these sections looking pristine. And the people are coming back and enjoying what they're seeing now in these sections and placing flowers. And we're really proud to be able to share, our progress, with the community. Next slide, please. Now over to the left here, these are some of the sections where my friend Rufus and the lady were working. When you could barely see them, this is the lower portion of the cemetery that we've been able to maintain. And believe it or not, after we cleared out all the brush and the underbrush, most of these sections which you're looking at, we used to cut by hand with a 21, 22-inch push mower. We just were fortunate enough to finally purchase a riding mower about 3 years ago. And that has truly made my life a lot better these days. Next slide, please. Once again, some more of our good works and areas that we are proud to say that we've really made a significant difference, and we've come a long way from July of 2015. Next slide. I Now, I don't want to give you the impression that everything is peaches and cream now, because it's far from it. We still have probably 12 to 14 acres that still looks exactly like this. What you see here is a group of volunteers from a U.S. bank who spent the day out in the cemetery a couple of weeks ago, giving us a hand, and we really appreciate, their efforts. We're blessed to have various church groups and organizations and what have you come out from time to time and give us a hand, but we still have a long way to go. But when I look at the other sections that I just showed you, how pristine they are, and I look at these sections, it reinforces in my mind that it can be done. So my goal is in the next couple of years to have the remainder of the cemetery looking as good as the front parts of the cemetery. Next slide, please. We have two baby sections in the cemetery. Section O, this is where I found baby boy Pinder's stone, probably in 2016. This resonated with me like you wouldn't believe, being a father, grandfather, to find this stone and the heartache and pain that this had to generate with the family stuck with me, like you wouldn't believe. And I guarantee you, if no other section in that cemetery gets maintained, Section O is going to always be maintained because of the children who are buried there in that section. But we also have another baby section that we really haven't been able to get to. That's up in Section 6. We're just now starting to get in there. And it's equally as important to me that we get in there and to do the right thing. I want to share a story about a family that has children buried in that section. In the fall of 1944, Elliot and Jeffy Walker and their 4 kids moved from Mississippi to St. Louis in search of better jobs and opportunities. What they found in St. Louis was strict segregation, low-paying jobs, and a chronic housing shortage that forced thousands of African Americans to live in crowded, unsanitary, and unsafe conditions. The family was forced to live in an attic of a single resident home that had been rented out single rooms to entire families. Each room had its own coal stove for heating and cooking. On the evening of Thursday, December 27th, 1945, Elliot was home with the children while Jeffy worked. A little after 7 p.m., the children were in bed. Elliot leaves the apartment to pick up a radio that was being repaired in a neighborhood shop. A fire apparently caused by an overheated stove started and engulfed the tiny attic room. The second-floor neighbor heard the screams, tried to rescue the children, but was driven back by the smoke and the flames, catching his hair on fire. When Elliot returned 15 minutes later, it was too late to save his children. The firemen got the flames under control and removed the bodies of the 4 kids huddled together, burned beyond recognition. The kids' ages 5, 3, 2, and 9 months were buried in a single casket in Greenwood Cemetery. This tragedy would eventually lead to meaningful conversations about discrimination in housing that would have far-reaching consequences. Next slide, please. In 2 years, we will be celebrating our 150th anniversary. And it just kind of dawned on us just recently that, it was fast approaching. To commemorate that momentous occasion, I've set as one of my goals between now and the 2 years that I'm going to find and uncover 150 stones that have been either overturned or buried below the ground, and I'm going to bring them back to light. And that is my mission I'm on right now, in addition to maintaining the cemetery. That's something I would like to be able to accomplish. Off to the right here is a marker that we found in one of our sections a couple of months ago. Not quite sure what it is. I know what it is. It looks like a dragon, but I don't know what the significance of it is or the story behind it. But I'm on a mission to try to find out what that's about too. Next slide, please. That's about all I have. My time is just about up, but I just wanted to say, if somebody would have told me 10 years ago that I'd be spending my time and my retirement, doing this in the cemetery, I would have told them that they were probably crazy. But there's truly nothing else I'd rather be doing right now. And a buddy of mine once said, you've got this retirement thing all wrong. And I told him, no, I think I got this one right. So thank you for your time and attention, and I appreciate the opportunity. I'll pass it over to Anton.
Thank you so much. I really am honored to be in conversation with Sháńdíín and Raphael, and I appreciate all of the work that each of you has done to really help make this world a better place. I'd also like to thank our hosts, Marissa especially, for pulling us all together for some really important conversations. Animaji tayan kawenui Ojibwe majines mi to da winda munugo gawian wagosh hindigu minawa migazi and dodem kazaga squaji mekag hindun jibba. Well, I just wanted to give you a brief shout out in my Ojibwe language, even though I know we're in mixed company today. To let you know, my native name is Wagosh, that means fox. I'm from the Eagle clan, and I come from Leech Lake, which is one of the Ojibwe communities in northern Minnesota. I have a rare and lucky circumstance in that I am a Native academic who gets to live in his home community, and I have appreciated that in so many different ways. I get to wear many hats, and I was asked today to share a little bit about one of them, which is connected to the broad theme for our gathering. How do we reconcile these competing public goods of freedom of speech and also the need for inclusivity and equity? And they bump up against each other sometimes. I was reading recently one of Desmond Tutu's books, The Book of Forgiving, which is really a powerful piece. That, the stories in there, a woman, for example, who created a peace institute and works every day with the men who murdered her daughter. And I just kind of marvel at the grace that some of the people summoned in the face of some really horrible circumstances. I think as we think about individual injustices and the historical ones, it's really important to think about what healing could look like. Our country and our world needs a lot more healing. And this analogy that Tutu provided, that when there's been an injustice, that it's so important that we are able to tell the story and have it received, put a name on the hurt. Then we can work towards forgiveness, which is not saying that what happened is okay, but saying we accept that this happened even though we cannot change it. And then we can actually have a real conversation about, should we renew or release a particular relationship? This applies very well to individual injustices, but to the broader historical ones too. So in an individual circumstance, if some dude goes out, cheats on his wife and wants to reconcile the relationship, you probably won't get too far saying, forget about it, that all happened in the past. And ultimately, has to receive the story from his partner about what that felt like and what that meant, and put a name on the hurt, in that case, betrayal, whatever. And then there can be a forgiveness in either, a divorce or a reconciliation. But if you can't make space to tell that story, to put a name on that hurt, then there's no way you can get a reconciliation. This applies with our big national injustices, from the obvious ones: slavery, genocide of Indigenous peoples, residential boarding schools for Indigenous peoples, but many, many other stories that have often been obscured from our awareness. And all the more important that what Sháńdíín or Raphael have been sharing today is so critically important, to share that story, to name it, and to have these stories received. It's part of the healing process and the humanization process for all of us. Now, I think it's obvious to me, but I'll say it anyways. America has a really hard time holding space for anybody to tell the story. And the little stories that we do share are the ones that tend to massage the narrative of American exceptionalism. We'll say, yeah, there was slavery, but we got, the Emancipation Proclamation, and how about Abraham Lincoln? Or we'll say, yeah, there was some Jim Crow stuff, but, how about we got a Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard in every major city in America now? The things that tend to prop up that narrative of exceptionalism are the ones that we have allowed broader exploration of. But people from often marginalized communities have been working hard, mobilizing resources, advocating for action, and it is getting a lot harder to avoid uncomfortable conversations about truth. And to me, truth and reconciliation begins with truth. Ultimately, these stories, some of them are more well-known than others. America has often compelled people from highly marginalized communities to swallow a spoonful of racism every time they go shopping, engage with our government, or even navigate public spaces like the town square. And it's getting harder. Like one time, one of my brothers had moved to California, went shopping, and saw this product for sale. And he's like, what the heck? Took a picture, texted it. I said, what the heck? Posted it to Facebook. And, some of my 5,000 closest friends on Facebook started posting, what the heck? I reached out to Old Town Baking Company, which manufactured this product, and said, are you aware that the word squaw is offensive to many people, and that there are issues of sexual violence directed at Native women? I think Sháńdíín did a great job pulling up some of the data, as well as some of the narratives that speak to this pervasive experience. And I said, nobody operates their business behind the walls of a castle anymore. And I'd like to give you a chance to respond. And I shared some information and context so that it could be a learning opportunity. And they responded by, saying, we're not going to do anything with that. Who do you think you are? You don't know what you're talking about. So I created a new Facebook page, Old Town Baking Company, Squaw Bread Needs a New Name. And people started piling on that one. They were cleaning their own Facebook page. And it was really just a matter of days before the owners were on the local news crying, saying, we didn't realize how offensive it was. We're going to convene a group and think about a new name for this product, which eventually they did. But they took the clunky awkward, contentious, and painful path when there were some others in front of them. And it's not just with food products. You know, this was a advertisement for a bar, and, you know, who knows, maybe they used an Italian actress for you know, the picture for this particular ad, but there's just so many things wrong here. Here's the white guy who's a happy drunk, the native guy who can't handle his liquor. You know, here's the sexual objectification of Native women again. And hello, we have substance abuse issues in Native communities, as well as issues of sexual violence directed at Native women. And this, you know, those cases actually have to do with private companies. There are many other things too. I think, for example, Sháńdíín's example with Dartmouth, where you have a private college that holds a lot of public events in space that is trying to create an inclusive learning environment that runs into some special problems. And then, of course, we have even more public spaces, public schools. And I won't go off on mascots, although I'm happy when we get to questions and answers to engage in more conversation around it. But it's not just what the hometown fans do, who often think they're honoring Native people, but it's what the opposing fans will do in the name of team spirit. Hey, Indians, get ready to leave in a trail of tears, round 2, hi Hawaii, kind of stuff. And ultimately, somewhere in the mission statement for this public school, it says something about education, and it says something about inclusive learning environment. And the mission gets compromised with choices like this. We've got stars and bars and Confederate flag issues. And it's a matter not just of freedom of speech, but when things like the stars and bars are not just hoisted on someone's private property or bumper stickers, problem enough. But when they are emblazoned on the state flags for 6 US states, that we are continuing to force people from marginalized groups to swallow a spoonful of racism, even to interact with the governments that represent them. And I realize that there are all kinds of perspectives about everything in our history. Frankly, we could look at the US Constitution, and one narrative will say that this is one of the finest documents ever created. Some people would say second only to the Bible. And the definition of we the people might have meant wealthy white male property owners, but the definition of we the people changed to include all of us on this call, most of us who were not included in we the people at its genesis, without having to throw the whole Constitution out. And that actually speaks to the power and beauty and adaptability of that Constitution, that it could change this way. And that all of us engaged in these conversations feel like, and actually do have the right to have an opinion about everything that has been messed up in America. And America's been a place that has created opportunity for all kinds of people. Of course, there's another version of the US Constitution that says, you know, this separation of powers and all of this language about states' rights, and even things like the Second Amendment, we're not really about freedom. But we're really about how can you have states, some of whom want to own other human beings and some that do not, united in a common nation. Well, you have to give a lot of power to states. And that the Second Amendment wasn't also about freedom, but enabling slave patrols to police Black bodies. If you really look at this, and by the way, we are so polarized and politicized, it's very difficult to have meaningful conversations about these things now. But if you really look at all the parts of America, it's not as simple as saying who's right, this one or this one. With the two examples that I provided just in framing things like the US Constitution, if we are honest about it, they both are. They both are. The US Constitution was created to enable slave patrols and slavery and a certain kind of freedom. And there's no way to separate those out, but we do have to hold space for the telling of that story. And we do have to evolve our polity, but even our culture, so that we can actually get to a different condition for America. You cannot get to healed and skip all the healing. You cannot get to reconciled and skip all the reconciling. And so we've seen pressure, and in many places, statues of Confederate generals and flags have been coming down. We've seen evolutions even with some of the state flags, but there is still a long way to go. You also have issues even with city flags and things like that. So as we think about these things, it's not just there, but there's kind of a spectrum of things from obviously tremendously problematic to borderline problematic and everything in between. And it's not always easy to determine where we should draw the lines and what we should do with art in public spaces. Now, I'm not really addicted to drama, but it does seem to find me in a number of my roles. I was on a committee that was evaluating art displayed in the Minnesota State Capitol, and these are some of the pieces: Battle Scene, and this one. And there's a lot of context to unpack. I'll do a little bit today, but we can take more during questions and answers too. I'm also on the governing board for the Minnesota State Historical Society. Minnesota's an interesting state in a number of ways. We are a purple state, and not just because of Prince. We are pretty evenly divided with Democrats and Republicans. Our state legislatures are divided, the House being controlled by Democrats, the Senate by Republicans. We've had both Democratic and Republican governors over the past decades. And as a result, it's really difficult to get things done there. And, you know, recently there was an effort to rename one of the lakes in the Twin Cities, Medemukashka, which used to be known as Lake Calhoun, Calhoun being a problematic historical figure for a variety of reasons, and successfully pushed through that name change. The Minnesota State Historical Society also curates property on the campus of Fort Snelling, which for the Dakota tribe is actually the place where the Great Spirit created and placed their people in their oral history and creation story. And the US government built an army fort right on top of it. And today there's still the army fort and the Twin Cities airport there. And there were all kinds of other things that happened in that place. Ultimately, you know, under consideration is changing the name to even acknowledge the Dakota presence and the importance of that place for the Dakota. And you should see the pushback. It's really difficult. So I'll do just a little unpacking on this particular image. So this is known as Father Hennepin's discovery of St. Anthony Falls. In the Twin Cities area, there's a waterfall, St. Anthony Falls, and it's right in the heart of Minneapolis. Now, historically, the context is quite different. Father Hennepin is kind of featured as the patriarch in this painting. The historical context is that he got lost and was kept as a subordinate. Some records have even indicated he might have been a prisoner of the Dakota at the time. They showed him this place. He didn't discover it. There were people living there. There are all kinds of things. And so this is a very imagined painting. And it was also placed, located within the Minnesota State Capitol. This and some of the other paintings in very prominent locations immediately behind the governor when he held press conferences on a regular basis, including press conferences that would involve policy that would have profound impact on Native nations whose territories are located in the present-day state of Minnesota. And so our group met and debated, these topics. Now, ultimately, I kind of feel like the process, which did have some robust public input, was still highly politicized. And the subcommittee that I was on really was empowered to make recommendations to another one, to make recommendations to the governor to take action. They did make some changes. I had actually recommended that we do something like what Dartmouth had done in the story that Sháńdíín shared, to take some of the more problematic pieces, not destroy them, to put them in a place where they could be properly contextualized so that we could explain about not just the power dynamics for this particular point in history, but we could actually provide some information even about the Dakota and Dakota culture. And we could put something a little more inclusive and not so controversial right behind the governor when he's doing press conferences. And the number one argument people made was that this would be, suppression of free speech. And that, that was the number one pushback. And so we had to really think about and discuss this stuff. All right, so I'll rock right along here. We do have these competing goods. And when you think about what is censorship, suppression, prohibition of art, film, or writing, if an object of art is removed from a particular place and put in another one where it can be viewed and contextualized, that doesn't suppress it or prohibit it. It just moves it. And so the question for me really is, what things deserve primacy of place in our public sphere? And there are layers to space: shared political space, shared public space, and also private space. And I believe that it's important that we preserve even the really offensive and troubling pieces of art. To me, Nazi flags, it's okay to put them up in a museum. It's different to fly them from the State House. And so as we do about these things, just remember that we do all have empowered positions in this work. I'm reminded of the Margaret Mead quote, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." And all of us need some healing, need to be more fully humanized, and we need to find ways to create that inclusive public space. So I like the Lila Watson quote too: "If you've come to help me, then you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is tied up with mine, then let us work together." I'm going to knock it off right there so we can have a discussion with the remaining time that we have. Thank you for your kind time and attention.
Wow, thank you so much, Anton, for sharing and ending with that quote. And Raphael and Sháńdíín, if you could join us. Thank you all so much. This was absolutely wonderful. And I'm all over the place. I'm scribbling, taking notes, and I'm like, what's the website? I'm going back, as I'm sure our panelists are as well. And with the few minutes that we have, I have so many questions, but with the few minutes that we have, and in an effort to kind of continue the thread that Anton, you started in terms of healing and reconciliation and how we move forward, I would love to ask you all to talk about, how do you imagine us moving forward? What are some ideal things? And all of you have started, or have been part of some really wonderful projects that have begun or have concluded or come to some term in the last 5 to 10 years. And so if there was something that you know now about going into the process that you would have known, that you would have benefited from knowing at the beginning, is there something, some 1-2 things that you could share with us to kind of move us forward? And anybody who wants to start, and while you all are thinking about that, I will just say again, like, I think as I was listening to you all talk, there are so many things that crossed my mind, but one of the things that I saw in the thread of all the things that you all are talking about was, as Anton, as you said so eloquently, like, we're working in small communities, we're working as in individuals and directly working in things that are in our space at Dartmouth College, which you think is just very directly about Dartmouth, or you're working at Greenwood Cemetery, which you think is very directly about a cemetery in the St. Louis region, or you're thinking very directly about what's going on at the State House in Minnesota, but it's all sending messages. And I think you all did a wonderful job of threading and showing how over time, those individual communities are telling a very collective story, and you're definitely having impact across our nation and indeed across our globe in terms of how we deal with each other, how we tell stories, if and when and how we make space for one another. And so I really want to thank you all for putting your individual works into context with our larger kind of conversation and what everybody's been doing. And so this work is extremely, extremely important. So thank you for your work. And if you have thought of anything as I'm rambling about your wonderful work and how you're showing this interconnectedness, I would love to hear you. Anybody who wants to start.
Thank you so much.
Well, one thing
Go
that
ahead, Raphael.
one thing that might help Greenwood going forward. Just very recently, we joined Black Cemetery Network, and it's amazing how there's so many Black cemeteries that could sit here and tell the same story, you know, that I shared, you know, with the group. There's another cemetery here, Washington Park, you know, out by the airport, that has a myriad of problems, you know, similar to Greenwood's. What I think we're going to strive for as a group, the Black Cemetery Network, you know, Greenwood, everybody else, we kind of need to work together to lobby for some sort of directive in sync ask. You know, I know there's legislation that had been proposed a year or two ago by Sherry Brown. I believe he's the Ohio senator, that he was proposing funding, you know, for African-American cemeteries. Here in the St. Louis area, I know our county supervisor was just recently talking about appropriating $10 million for nonprofits in the area. I think if we all kind of get together and work towards improving life and conditions for everybody, you know, it might trickle down and everybody might get a bit to kind of help with what they're working towards.
Wonderful community. Anton, did you want to?
You know, these are delicate topics, and I think it is important to separate out our notions of what we think appropriate art is from what our political action should be. Ultimately, of course, we should do the right thing. But if we legislate the right thing, and sometimes that is exactly what's needed, but I think there is a danger to overreach and creating a legal precedent that can be, that sword can cut both ways and can be used to marginalize and suppress the marginalized or anybody. And ultimately, I think it is powerful when, like with Sháńdíín's example, you know, you have robust conversation, consensus, and then action. rather than the state of New Hampshire saying you are compelled to remove that. It more effectively represents the will of the people and shows cooperative and collaborative action. And this is a country where people we prize our freedoms, and for some good reasons. And we do have to make sure that we don't overreach at the same time that we demand justice and try to resculpt our public space and what things deserve primacy of place. So we have to be careful as we advocate for the right things.
I can also add in before we maybe move on to another question. I think, in my specific circumstance, what I really learned and think would be good to share with everyone who's here is like coming to conversations with an open mind and an open heart. Like when I first saw the Hovey murals, I felt very adamant about them being destroyed because I think that was coming from a place of a lot of anger because of my own experiences and my friends' experiences and my family's experiences. And it was difficult because I was also, I was young. I would think I was 17 when I first saw those. And you grow and you change. And then I started working in the museum industry and seeing how actually keeping them in the Hood Museum's collection holds the institution accountable so that things like this, won't happen again, or that the story is told and it's told in an appropriate way. So, to answer the question, I think for me, it was just being open-minded and understanding that my own personal feelings can change and that it's natural to have a change of heart, but also honoring that anger that I had because it was coming from a place of, integrity. And yeah, so there's my answer.
Yeah, I think those are all great answers. And Sháńdíín, thank you for bringing that back to my mind. And also Anton saying like, these are really delicate conversations, to use Anton's words. It's very delicate conversations, and it can bring up a lot of emotions. Like that's why we're having these conversations, because they bring up so much emotion and memory. And in order to make space, we do have to recognize that they will bring up emotion. And I appreciate, even in your presentation, Sháńdíín, that you gave us the warning, and then there was the opportunity, there's a resource at the end. And I think as I was listening to you all, there were moments where I'm like, oh, whoa, like that happened, or I'm seeing this slide and it's like, wow. And it's, yes, those are the things that people are encountering just by happenstance, if you will, in their day-to-day. And this is the harm that can be caused. And so to go back to Anton's kind of equation, for lack of, our steps towards healing and reconciliation, I appreciated you like outlining like these are the things and this is the way that we need to go. But everybody, all three of you talked about preservation. And I think Sháńdíín, you said we're keeping these in hopes that we won't repeat. And so I'm wondering if you all could talk a little bit more about the necessity for preserving, I guess, for Sháńdíín and Anton, like these things that are so destructive, but also Raphael, for you, for like, what does it mean that that cemetery was not or is not completely in pristine condition? And so what does it mean to be erased? And what does it mean to be held in this esteem, in this regard, very visibly in a way that can be destructive? And so how does preservation play into those kind of modes of erasure and also highly visible, for lack of a better term, disrespect? Anybody, if that made any sense.
It did. Honestly, I really believe one of the most important things is to have direct communication from whoever's being affected by things. All too often, I feel like this, especially with the Native American experience, we are often imagined, we are infrequently well understood. If people were actually having conversations and not ignoring those conversations, you'd have very different results. Like and people, there's so many voices out there. The problem used to be, how do I find a needle in a haystack? And now it's, which needle in this stack of needles do I pay attention to? And so we have some different dilemmas now, but I know there's a country music singer, Gretchen Wilson, sings I'm a redneck woman, I ain't no high class broad. I don't know if you ever heard that song. Does that mean I get to meet every redneck woman, every white woman I meet and call her redneck woman? No. Might somebody be offended? Yes. Can I say you don't have a right to be offended because Gretchen Wilson's totally down with that? No, and it's like this with a lot of our art and public spaces. If there is a community directly impacted or being interpreted, we need to have the variety of voices and perspectives coming from that community to inform the effort. And then, I think we can learn a lot from our many mistakes by preserving things, providing context and interpretation. Probably most of the books I've written, somebody's going to have a totally different perspective on them, especially 100 years from now. And that's healthy and good, and so we should accept and embrace that part of our experience.
We only have a few more minutes. So if you all wanted to respond further to that question or add on to Anton, I also wanted to give you all the opportunity to have a final comments. There's so much to unpack in all of your presentations. And I know we only got teasers of the things that you all are working on. So if there's something that you wanted to leave us with this conference of folks who are like-minded in terms of making space for these types of conversations and these types of works, and maybe some encouragement or just some idea that you're like, don't forget this thing, we would love, love, love to hear it.
I can do like a final comment. So I know we briefly talked about Dartmouth's history with Samson Occam, and so on Wednesday, Dartmouth actually gave back multiple archival letters from Samson Occam to the Mohegan tribe that were dated to around the same time as the founding. So they're about 300 years old. Some of them are written in English and some of them are written in the Mohegan language. So I think when we're having this conversation about material culture, and I talk about this a lot at the museum industry or field, for different groups of people, material culture means different things. For us as Indigenous people, a lot of times those relationships are equitable. We see objects in different ways than maybe the Western society. So for Mohegan tribe, I feel like they felt very excited about almost like an ancestor coming home with Occam's documents. And feel free to research this more because there is news articles about this repatriation. And so, I think it's a long time for those documents and archives to come home, but it can happen. And so just being hopeful that the road ahead is bright, it just might be really long, and being patient with ourselves and with our colleagues, because a lot of us didn't cause this colonial violence, so we can't expect it to just be fixed so quickly. And it's hard though, because, I want things to happen night and day, but with my presentation, those murals were up for 80 years. And things just take time, but I think it's worth it in the end. And final comment, just want to say thank you to Raphael and Anton. I really appreciated your presentations and sharing with us today.
Thank you. I'm just thoroughly overwhelmed and impressed with the stories I've heard the last 2 days, and the battles that Anton and Shadeen are fighting are a lot different from my battles, and I think mine are easier, even though I'm going up against Mother Nature and I never win. But you guys are fighting battles trying to change minds and perspectives and things like that. And that can be very frustrating dealing with people who may not be of a like mind. I'll go out here in the cemetery and I'm fighting brush, that might be 10 or 12 feet tall, but I do know probably by the end of the day, I'm going to get this section cleared. your battle is a little bit more challenging and a little bit more difficult, you know, than what mine probably is. But I take my hat off to both of you and what you're accomplished and have accomplished. And all I can say is just keep fighting a good fight, and we'll get through this.
Yeah, thanks, Raphael. You know, to me, your fight is just as important. You know, what really got things that messed up was being ignored, being marginalized, not having, you know, Black bodies held in the same regard as other bodies. And, you know, I think in many ways you're a step ahead of some of these other things, because the answer is not just saying what not to do, right? Like as the things that I've been speaking to, but here's what to do. Here's what healing looks like. Here's what rebuilding looks like. Here's what, you know, giving the right narratives interpreted by people from those communities, primacy of place looks like. And I think ultimately, you know, that's the answer, that it's the rebuilding work. And that encompasses a broad array of things, building bridges between people who have experienced the world differently from us, building new, better public art to give primacy of place, and building new interpretations of the old stuff so we can learn from it. It's all connected.
I agree.
Absolutely. Thank you all so very much for sharing your stories, sharing your work, and giving these encouraging words for the continuation of the work that you're doing. As Anton just said, I think all of you all's work is absolutely important in leveling some of these playing fields that we have in terms of how we see, view, and experience these mundane and everyday places, and making space for all of our stories and all of our experiences. I think I'm going to turn it over to Marissa, turn it back over to Marissa. Thank you again. Thank you, Marissa, for bringing us all together for this wonderful, wonderful conference and this great panel.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks to our speakers for such a thoughtful set of presentations. I've been seeing in the chat box just so many people saying these are powerful words. And then also, I think, you know, what you were all saying to each other too, is that these are words that have been backed up with really powerful actions. So this session is our last that features speaker presentations. And so I want to just take this opportunity to thank all of the speakers and moderators who across the 2 days on Zoom shared so generously, and also, as we saw with this panel, so honestly. The stories that they navigate as they navigate through their work, the questions that are really at the heart of this conference. So we've heard from such a wonderful diversity of voices and perspectives. And I also want to take a moment to recognize that some of them are paid to do the work that they have shared, and many are not. They are doing this work in service to their communities. And so this kind of personal commitment that they bring to the work is part of, I think, what has made these presentations so moving and hopefully so inspiring. I think there are a couple of strands that came out across the 2 days. You know, some of the speakers are working inside of institutions to make change, and others left institutions that they felt were not ready to make meaningful change. They are, all of the people we heard are working to radically remake our shared public space. We heard from artists, elected officials, attorneys, public historians, tribal leaders, curators, and heritage administrators, and many more who are kind of multi-hyphenated across different fields. This work is happening through international networks like the International National Trust Organization in the UK, and then in the smaller nonprofits like Raphael's Greenwood Cemetery Preservation Association. In particular, I want to acknowledge the work that the Native speakers are doing to take on inaccurate or caricatured depictions and stories about Indigenous histories and lifeways. Stories that have been used, as we well know, to justify colonial settlement and Native displacement. I think across the 2 days, one thing that has just come through so strongly is that we really are in the midst of a reckoning as communities across the country and even across the globe are seeking to change how and whose history is told and commemorated in public space. This might lead to radical changes to the art that hangs on walls, such as the Hovey murals, the monuments in our public squares, and the stories that are told at historic sites, as the public landscape that we've inherited continues to evolve, as it always has. As we close, I'd like to thank two institutions that provided necessary support for this, the Terra Foundation for American Art in Chicago and the Brown Arts Institute, as well as two of my colleagues at the Center for Public Humanities, Sabina Griffin and Ron Potvin, the 6 Brown-based moderators, including Kenvi Phillips, who are with us today and were with us yesterday, and the 2 public humanities graduate students who did speaker introductions, not today, but earlier today, or not with this session, but earlier today and yesterday, Tracy Picard and Sophia Ellis. I'd also really like to thank Jake LaFond and Hannah Elliott of Brown for making all of this possible on Zoom. So with that, we are going to conclude the session presentations. For those who are interested in gathering together to have kind of smaller breakout conversations about some of the issues raised during the Inheritance Conference, I am going to put a Zoom link into the chat in a second with a passcode. And that is, unfortunately, sorry to send everyone around in various Zoom rooms, but that is where we can meet again. There you go. At 3:25, which is in a little less than 10 minutes. To have some kind of smaller conversations with each other about some of these issues. So I'll see you there if you can make it. And if you can't, thanks so much for coming to Inheritance. And most of all, thanks to the speakers and the moderators for being the conference, for sharing your work and taking time away from the work itself to share the work. It was really impactful. And I know very inspiring to everyone who's here. So thanks a lot. Bye.